In this mess now, waitress." The command cut through the elegant dining room like a blade through silk, forcing every conversation to halt mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison toward the source of the voice, a woman dressed in designer clothing who sat at the center table with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. At her feet lay a wine glass, deliberately knocked over, its deep red contents spreading across the polished marble floor like an accusation. Standing before her was a young woman in her late 20s, her dark hair pulled back simply, her clothes neat but unmistakably modest compared to the luxury surrounding her. Some assumed she was a new member of the waitstaff, others looked away uncomfortably, unwilling to intervene. No one spoke up. "I said clean it," the woman repeated, her smile cold and calculated, as if she were testing the limits of her own authority. The atmosphere grew heavy with tension, and not a single person in that room could have imagined that within minutes that humiliating command would be remembered as the biggest mistake of the evening. This was not just any dinner. It was a carefully orchestrated event held on a Friday night at 8 o'clock in the city's most exclusive private dining club. The kind of place where reservations were made 6 months in advance and where a single table cost more than most people earned in a year. The guest list included top executives, board members, and shareholders of Meridian Strategic Group, a billion-dollar investment firm known for its aggressive expansion and ruthless business tactics. Tailored suits, imported watches, hushed conversations about mergers, acquisitions, and power. The official reason for the gathering was to celebrate the company's record-breaking quarterly earnings, but the real purpose was something else entirely. That night, the new majority stakeholder would be introduced, the person who had just acquired a controlling interest in the company and who would now have final say over the future of everyone seated at those tables. Very few knew who this person was. Even fewer would have recognized them on sight. Among those present, one figure stood out not for elegance, but for cruelty. Victoria Harlow, one of the firm's longest-serving partners. Wealthy, influential, and notorious for her sharp tongue and unforgiving nature, Victoria didn't ask, she commanded, and she made it a point to remind everyone around her exactly who was in charge. To her, hierarchy was everything. Those above gave orders, those below obeyed or were crushed. So when her eyes landed on the young woman standing quietly near the main table, Victoria didn't even consider another possibility. In her mind, the woman's simple clothing and unassuming presence could only mean one thing. She was staff, someone who existed to serve, not to speak. The young woman's name was Eliza. Few people in that room knew her name, and absolutely no one recognized her when she first approached the main table. Eliza was 28 years old, with warm brown eyes, a composed demeanor, and the kind of presence that didn't demand attention, but also refused to shrink. She wasn't carrying trays. She wasn't wearing a uniform. Still, her modest appearance stood in stark contrast to the room filled with expensive fabrics, glittering jewelry, and watches worth more than most people's cars. When Eliza reached the main table, she paused beside one of the empty chairs, glancing around as if waiting for someone to greet her. No smiles, no introductions. Victoria was the first to speak. Her gaze swept over Eliza slowly, deliberately, not out of curiosity, but out of contempt. "Are you lost?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to cut. Eliza took a slow breath. "Good evening. I was invited to this event." Victoria let out a short, humorless laugh. Invited? A few executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others pretended not to hear. Victoria leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. "Look around. This is a dinner for partners and executives." She made a vague gesture with her hand. "Staff enters afterward." Eliza kept her voice steady. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. My name is Eliza, and I—" Victoria raised her hand, cutting her off. The silence that followed was suffocating. "If you're here to serve, Then do your job. Victoria lifted her champagne glass toward Eliza, expecting it to be refilled. Eliza felt the weight of every stare in the room, some curious, some uncomfortable, none brave enough to intervene. She stood there, not out of fear, but because she was beginning to understand something. This woman didn't want to listen. She wanted to control. And this was only the beginning. Victoria leaned back in her chair, far too comfortable for someone who believed she had absolute power over the situation. "Are you even listening to me?" she asked, tapping her fingers lightly against the table. Eliza nodded. "I am." "Then why are you still standing there?" A few side conversations stopped. Silverware was set down quietly. Eliza kept her hands folded in front of her. "Because I'm not a waitress." The air seemed to thin. Victoria raised an eyebrow as if observing something mildly entertaining. "Of course you are." She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Don't you think if you were actually invited, you'd be dressed differently?" Eliza felt the sting, not from the words themselves, but from what they carried. "My clothing doesn't define who I am." A murmur rippled through the table. Victoria leaned forward. "Here, it does. It defines everything." She gestured subtly toward the jewelry she wore. "We belong to different worlds." Eliza took a breath, keeping her voice calm. "I belong here just as much as anyone else." Victoria let out a low laugh. "Look at this." She turned to the other executives. "Now we have waitstaff with corporate ambitions." A few people laughed nervously. Others looked away, too embarrassed to laugh, but also too afraid to defend. Eliza felt her face flush. "I'm only asking for a chance to explain." Victoria raised her hand again, impatient. "No!" She pushed her chair back slightly, standing halfway. "You're delaying an important meeting." Then, in a calculated move, Victoria picked up the wine glass beside her plate, tilted it slightly, and let it fall. The sound of glass shattering against marble echoed like a slap. Red wine spread across the floor in a dark, accusing pool. Victoria pointed downward. "Clean it." The room fell into absolute silence. Eliza stared at the broken glass. Then she lifted her eyes, and for the first time there was no hesitation in her gaze, because in that moment she made a decision. If she was going to stay in that room, it would not be on her knees. Eliza didn't move. The simple act, or rather the absence of it, was enough to shift the entire atmosphere at the table. Victoria remained standing, her finger still pointing at the floor. The smile was gone. "I told you to clean it." Her voice was no longer cold. It was sharp. Eliza kept her posture straight. "And I told you I'm not your employee." One of the senior directors cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Victoria, perhaps we should—" "No!" She cut him off without even looking. "This meeting is mine." She turned her eyes back to Eliza. "Do you have any idea what a mistake like this costs here? Do you understand where you are?" Eliza replied calmly, controlled. "I know exactly where I am." Victoria let out a short laugh. "Then kneel." "Nay." A few executives' eyes widened. This was no longer just arrogance. This was deliberate humiliation. Eliza felt a knot form in her stomach, not from fear, but from memory. She thought of her mother, who always told her never to bow her head to people who fed on the suffering of others. She thought of the years she had been ignored in rooms just like this one. She thought of the real reason she was there. She took a deep breath. "This ends now." Victoria leaned in, provocative. "What are you going to do, cry?" Before Eliza could respond, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound echoed. It was the chief financial officer. "Victoria, enough." The room froze. She turned slowly. "Are you telling me what to do?" "I'm telling you this has gone too far." Victoria laughed. "Do you all really believe this little performance?" She pointed at Eliza, a waitress looking for attention. Eliza took one step forward, her voice firm. "My name is Eliza." Victoria crossed her arms. "I didn't ask." It was then that the restaurant manager approached, visibly nervous. "Excuse me," Victoria ignored him. "Take her out of here." The manager hesitated. "Ma'am, she's on the guest list." A murmur swept through the room. Victoria turned her head slowly. "What?" The manager swallowed hard. "Main table." Silence. Eliza kept her eyes fixed on Victoria. "I told you I belonged here." Victoria's smile faltered for the first time. But the real shock was still to come. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had started as a corporate dinner now felt like a room full of people holding their breath, waiting for something to break. The clinking of silverware had stopped. Side conversations had died. Even the restaurant itself seemed to shrink under the weight of what was unfolding. Eliza remained standing calm, while everyone began to study her more closely. There was no rush in her movements, no exaggerated nervousness. Her posture didn't match someone who was there by accident. Victoria, on the other hand, felt something unfamiliar rising inside her. It wasn't guilt. It was frustration at realizing that control was slipping away. A few executives exchanged discreet glances. They knew the real reason for that evening's gathering. They knew a new stakeholder was about to be introduced. And in that moment, the coincidence was starting to become uncomfortable. The restaurant manager stepped back, clearly unsure of what to do next. He didn't dare interfere anymore. This situation no longer belonged to him. Eliza took a slow breath, and without raising her voice, made it clear that she wasn't there to serve tables. She said just enough to reaffirm that her presence was legitimate. Nothing more. Victoria tried to regain dominance with sarcastic comments and impatient gestures, but she no longer found the same submission. The silence that had once favored her now worked against her. It was then that one of the most senior partners noticed Eliza's name on the list sitting on the table. He read it again, confirmed the last name, and froze. His expression changed. His face lost color. He didn't say anything out loud, but he leaned discreetly toward another director, pointing at the paper. The effect was immediate. Tension spread like a shiver through the room. Eliza noticed. She didn't smile. She didn't explain. She waited. Victoria was still talking, but she was no longer the center of attention. Every gaze had shifted. They were all now fixed on the young woman she had tried to humiliate. It was at that moment that someone called for silence, not as a command, but as a necessity. The meeting was about to spiral completely out of control, and the truth, until now ignored, was seconds away from being revealed. The silence that formed wasn't imposed, it simply happened. One of the company's most senior directors stood slowly. There was no indignation on his face, only seriousness. He gestured for everyone's attention with a quiet authority, as if he knew that every second from that point forward would change the course of the night. All eyes turned to him. Victoria tried to interrupt, but she couldn't. For the first time since the event began, her authority wasn't enough to silence someone. The director explained in straightforward terms that this dinner wasn't just a celebration. It was the formalization of a new chapter for the company, one that involved the entrance of a new strategic partner, someone responsible for the largest acquisition the firm had ever seen. As he spoke, some executives began to understand. Others still resisted the idea. Victoria, seated at the head of the table, kept her gaze fixed, but her posture was no longer one of dominance. It was one of alert. The director then mentioned the new stakeholder's full name, Eliza. The impact was immediate. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others' eyes widened. A low murmur swept through the room, quickly contained. Victoria laughed, a short, disbelieving laugh, like someone trying to cling to their own narrative to avoid sinking. But no one joined her. The director continued. He explained that Eliza had spent weeks quietly analyzing the company, observing processes, people, behaviors. He said this was part of a personal requirement she had before finalizing any contract. She wanted to understand the company's real culture, not the one that appeared in reports, but the one that revealed itself behind closed doors. The room grew heavy. Some executives avoided looking at Eliza. Others began to remember small comments, glances, attitudes they had ignored over the years. Victoria tried to defend herself, not with direct words, but with vague justifications, attempting to minimize what had happened as a misunderstanding. But the damage was already done. The director made it clear that the conduct displayed that evening would not be recorded as an isolated incident, but as a reflection of a pattern that had been discussed internally for some time. Eliza remained silent through almost the entire speech. There was no satisfaction on her face, no desire for revenge. When she finally spoke, it was brief. She said she wasn't there to humiliate anyone, that she didn't need that to prove her worth, but that she believed respect was non-negotiable. She explained that she could have introduced herself from the very first moment, but she chose to observe. And what she saw that night confirmed decisions that had already been forming. Victoria tried to hold her gaze but couldn't. The image of the powerful woman was beginning to crumble right there in front of everyone, not with shouting, not with scandal, but with facts. The atmosphere in the room was one of silent shock. The humiliation had shifted sides, and everyone knew that night wasn't over yet. The meeting ended a few minutes later, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been exposed. The dining room, once filled with controlled laughter and strategic conversations, now felt like a strange, hollow space. Executives rose slowly, some avoiding eye contact, others still trying to process what they had witnessed. Victoria was the last to leave the table. The woman who used to command the room with arrogance now walked without certainty. There was no public announcement, no final dramatic scene, but everyone knew. The next morning, the board would meet, and the events of that night would not be forgotten or treated as a minor detail. Eliza stayed in the restaurant for a few moments, observing the empty space. She hadn't earned respect by instilling fear. She had earned it by revealing truth. Days later, the internal memo was sent. The company's structure would undergo profound changes. Positions would be reviewed. Ethical evaluation processes would be implemented. Victoria would leave the partnership, not as immediate punishment, but as the natural consequence of behavior that could no longer be sustained. The power she believed she possessed didn't come from competence. It came from the silence of others, and that silence had ended. Eliza assumed her position without fanfare. She didn't need to justify herself or explain who she was. She became known not for the money she brought, but for the standard she set. Among employees, the story spread quickly, not as gossip, but as an example. The broken wine glass stopped being just a detail. It became a symbol of how small acts of humiliation reveal massive failures, and of how sometimes the person who seems invisible is simply watching. Because that night it wasn't a command that echoed the loudest. It was the fall of arrogance built on prejudice and the rise of respect that does not bow. Arrogance often speaks loudly, but truth always speaks last, and it speaks louder. That night, it wasn't a wine glass on the floor that marked that company. It was the fall of someone who believed power gave them the right to humiliate. Never judge a person by their appearance, their clothing, or their silence. Often, the person who seems small is simply waiting for the right moment to stand. Because humiliation may last a few seconds, but the shame of those who humiliate lasts forever. And remember, sometimes the person you order around today is exactly the one who tomorrow will have the power to decide your future. And you, what would you do if you were in Eliza's position? Comment below, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel. Your support strengthens stories like this one.